Hi everyone, and welcome to today's video. We are diving into J.R.R. Tolkien's universe, or rather into the languages that he created for his legendary. This will be a series of several videos where I will be discussing various characteristics of Tolkien's created languages, each with a focus on a particular linguistic category, as well as practical examples. But today's video is more of a general overview, an introduction into the most relevant or most developed languages that J.R.R. Tolkien created for his universe. And don't worry if you're not a linguist, you don't have to be. I'll keep it simple and understandable, comprehensive. So all you need to do is be curious.
What say you?
Okay, then let's go. So J.R.R. Tolkien is not renowned just because of his vast and complex universe that he created, also because of his incredibly detailed constructed languages that he created just as a basis for his work. I've always found this to be sort of perfect because when you think about it, language is indeed one of the foundation stones for every culture. So it only makes sense that when you create another culture, a fictional one, you should also create a language for it. It kind of goes hand in hand. And Tolkien truly created his fictional world from the ground up, from the mythological creation that actually starts with a song, right, to the more proper languages. So let's finally focus on the languages in the Silmarillion, in Lord of the Rings, in the Hobbit, and his other work. These fictional languages are known as conlangs, or constructed languages. Here belong, of course, Tolkien's languages, for example, Sindarin and Quenya, but also, for example, Klingon from Star Trek, or the Dothraki language that was created for the Game of Thrones, and many, many more. Tolkien was a scholar, a linguist, right? He was familiar with a vast number of languages. We're talking Latin, Greek, various Romance languages like Italian, Spanish, even Old Norse, Old English. And he also developed an interest in Finnish, which he found particularly lovely and intoxicating in his own words. So all these languages influenced his creation of constructed languages. Some were more developed than others, and we are going to look at 4 most developed ones, or perhaps the most relevant, and also representative of each of the main cultures in Middle-earth. We will look at Sindarin and Quenya, 2 Elvish languages, then Khuzdul, which is the Dwarven language, and we will look at Mannish languages, so languages of men of Middle-earth. Let me know if you're interested in any other language, like maybe Black speech. I didn't originally intend to include it here, but I might in the future videos if there's any interest. So let's begin with the Elvish languages. Tolkien actually created several, but most of them aren't really that developed. The most well-known and developed ones are Quenya and Sindarin. They were both originally written in Kirth, which was a type of script, a runic alphabet, and later they were written in a script called Tengwar. Tengwar literally means letters in Quenya. And within the fictional context of Middle-earth, of Tolkien's universe, Tengwar, the script, was developed by the elf Feanor. So let us begin with Sindarin. The Sindar were a group of Telerin elves who stayed behind in Beleriand and did not travel to Valinor. So Sindarin became known as the language of the Grey Elves of Beleriand. Sindarin derives from Common Telerin, which originates from Common Eldarin, which is the name for the elves, or a group of elves, right? And this was a tongue that was spoken before the division, before the sundering of elves. As for the real-life influence, some of Sindarin's grammar is based on Welsh, Celtic, as well as some influences from Old Norse and Old English. In the Second Age, besides the elves of course, many men of Numenor were also fluent in Sindarin. And while the dwarves of the Third Age use mainly Westron, back in the day they would also use both Quenya and Sindarin to communicate to elves, because they didn't really like to reveal their language, their private language, Khuzdul, to outsiders. In the Third Age, where Lord of the Rings is set, Sindarin is kind of known as the common language of elves that most elves use for communication, whereas Quenya is reserved as a more poetic language for special use. Quenya and Sindarin were related. They have many similar words, but grammar and structure are quite different, which we will see in the future videos. Next is Quenya. Tolkien started creating Quenya in 1910s, and over the years the grammar underwent many reconstructions. So the name of the language changed from Elfin to Quenya to Quenya. As I mentioned before, Tolkien's great love was Finnish, and that was the major source of inspiration for Quenya. And what is really fascinating about Tolkien's language creation is that his languages changed and developed over time, right? Like normal languages would. They didn't exist in a vacuum, just like real languages don't. He made them change as a result of migrations and of, different peoples meeting and interacting, which makes a lot of sense. Quenya originated as the speech of the Noldor and the Vanya. Those were two clans of elves who went to live in Valinor, who left Middle-earth. And actually some of them did return, or they met with the Sindarin-speaking Grey Elves, and so Sindarin was eventually adopted by them as well. As I mentioned before, Quenya became used less and less and became sort of restricted for poetic use or for special use. It also became synonymous with a sort of high status of the elves and of the slowly dying, slowly fading elven culture in Middle-earth. And here's for another bit of Tolkien's genius. So for the elves of Middle-earth, Quenya was spoken with a different dialect as opposed to Quenya that continued to be used in Valinor, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it, right? Language would change depending on the circumstances and the people who spoke it. So if two peoples lived so far apart and in such different circumstances, it is quite natural to assume that the language would also change. So in the Second Age, some men of Numenor would learn, as I mentioned, Sindarin and also Quenya, and in the Third Age, Quenya was learned as a sort of second language by all elves of the Noldoran origin. The longest text in Quenya is the poem Lana Marie, which you can see here, well, an excerpt of it, and here is a short clip of Professor Tolkien reciting it. And now we march onwards into the Dwarven halls. Khuzdul was a very private, almost secret language of the dwarves. The script in which Khuzdul is written is also called Kirth, the runic system that I mentioned in the beginning. Tolkien began developing Khuzdul before the publication of The Hobbit in 1936, and he based it on Semitic languages, mainly Hebrew. Now, this may be a slightly controversial topic today, but Tolkien, in his own words, described the similarities that he saw between the dwarves and the Jewish people. He described how both were, quote, at once natives and aliens in their habitations, speaking the languages of the country, but with an accent due to their own private tongue. Make of that what you will. For Khuzdul, very limited vocabulary is known, but apparently some material on the phonology and root modification did survive, though to this date has not yet been published. In Tolkien's fictional world, Khuzdul is an almost secret language that dwarves don't like to reveal to others and only speak among each other, with a few exceptions. Now, they even have their inner names, which are not known to other races, to the outsiders, and the names we do know from them are their so-called outer name. But there's more. In addition to their aglab, spoken tongue, the dwarves also have a sign language called Iglishmek. I hope I'm saying this right. Of course, the elves were created by Aule as a people, but also he taught them the language. This is interesting because it makes Khuzdul, both in reality and in fiction, a constructed language. As far as language changes and development go, Khuzdul is a bit different because of its secrecy and privacy. It didn't really change throughout the ages or among different dwarven clans, and while they didn't teach it to other races, often there are a few examples, a few exceptions, for example the elf Curufin and the elf Eol, who could speak Khuzdul. There are also a few similarities between Khuzdul and the Mannish languages, the native tongues of the men of the East. Because back in the day, men in that part of Middle-earth had contact with the dwarves, right? So they would naturally take on some characteristics of Khuzdul. It was mostly isolated words, but some influences were retained. For example, Adonaic, the language of the men of Numenor, does have Khuzdul influence. And this brings us neatly to Mannish languages, the languages of men of Middle-earth. There are several mentioned and or constructed in Tolkien's universe, so I'll try to keep it as simple and basic as possible, covering, just the kind of the main one. Languages of men developed when the Edain started to migrate west. What would eventually become the houses of Beor and Hador, or Marak, would have one language, one type of language, whereas the House of Haleth would speak another tongue. Eventually, the House of Beor adopted Sindarin, and the House of Hador was influenced by Khuzdul. This language of the House of Hador would eventually develop into Adonaic, and Adonaic was spoken in Numenor. And Adonaic was spoken in Numenor because most men of Numenor descended from the House of... And this Adonaic developed into common speech through contact with different cultures in the West, in Middle-earth. And in fact, in Numenor, after the division into the Kingsmen and the Faithful, the language also underwent a sort of division. The Faithful considered Sindarin their mother tongue. And they did still use common speech in context of trading with other people. They still enriched it with many Elven words. So from Adonaic developed Westron. As I mentioned in the beginning, Westron was a sort of common speech spoken by most peoples, so by hobbits and by the men of Middle-earth. If we were to draw parallels, we could say that it is a sort of equivalent to modern contemporary English. And once again, we can see the parallels between the real-world influences and Tolkien's constructed languages. So for example, the people of Dale, whose language was influenced by Khuzdul through trade and contact with the dwarves. So their language spoken in Dale versus Westron, be a sort of fictional equivalent to Old Norse versus modern English. Or another example, the Rohanese represents a sort of archaic relative to Westron. Similarly to what Anglo-Saxon, Old English, would be to modern English. So yes, the language of the Rohirrim was not Westron, but they did speak Westron in interlingual circumstances. Under King Thengel of Rohan, the common speech became used more and more and became used as the language of court instead of the native Rohanese. So technically, when you look at Eowyn, Theoden, Eomer, they were basically bilingual in common speech in Westron as well as in their native Rohani. In addition to these languages, we also have many languages, at least, mentioned in Tolkien's works. We have numerous languages of the Haradrim and of the Easterlings. We, of course, have the Black Speech of Mordor, we have Orcish, we have languages of the Ainur, Enti. There really is a lot to unpack when it comes to Mannish, and even not really Mannish languages, but just in general, Tolkien's constructed languages, because it is such an extensive topic. But we can still make a sort of summary and say that numerous different cultures in Middle-earth had their own, at least dialect, and if not dialect, their own language. So that is the intro to Tolkien's constructed languages, I guess. Let me know if I forgot something. I'll be happy to hear you fill in the blanks in the comments. In the upcoming videos, like I said, I will do a deep dive into the languages that I covered today. I plan to look at morphology and phonetics, so how the words are constructed and how the speech sounds, right, are constructed, and look at that a little bit with each language. And then also syntax. I might also include a little bit of etymology, so origin of words, where that is applicable. We'll see. So if you don't want to miss those videos, please consider subscribing. We do a lot of different things on this channel, but Lord of the Rings content is a sort of constant. Take care, and I will see you soon in another video.